In recent years, South Korea has become a global benchmark for music, technology, and popular culture. However, hidden among its towering buildings and secluded villages lie some of the most unsettling cases I have ever heard of. In this video, we will tell you about just a few of them. So, get comfortable and turn off the lights, because these are 7 disturbing cases from South Korea. Before we begin, we remind you that you can also listen to our content on Spotify or your favorite podcast platform. How are you doing? Good morning, afternoon, or evening. Let's begin. The disappearance of Choi Sun and John Minong. We start with one of the most bizarre cases we have found, not only in South Korea but in the entire world. Choi Sun was a 33-year-old theater actress, beloved in Busan, and coming from a family dedicated to the arts. Her father had been a singer and actor, and her mother a choreographer. After getting married, she dedicated a large part of her time to studying scripts and preparing plays with an independent theater group. Her husband, John Minong, 38, managed a family restaurant in Busan and dreamed of expanding this business. In his free time, he enjoyed riding his bicycle and spending time with Sun. They had met through mutual friends and married in November 2015. Their closest friends described them as an ideal couple, united by shared projects and life plans. They lived in a modest apartment in the Yanggu district. They led a quiet and happy life, at least until the night of the 27th of May 2016. That night, Sun returned home alone around 11:45 p.m. After a rehearsal, she had gone to buy some things at a convenience store. The building's cameras captured her entering the elevator to go to her apartment, carrying shopping bags. Later, around 3:00 a.m., her husband arrived at the building after spending time drinking with some friends. The cameras also recorded his arrival, but that was the last time the couple was ever seen. The 22 security cameras never recorded them leaving the building, and no one saw them again. On May 31, the father of Ming Yoon decided to call the police after having no news of his son or his daughter-in-law. When the authorities arrived at the apartment, they found the shopping bags still intact on the hallway table. There were no signs of violence or forced entry, and documents such as the couple's passports and IDs were still there. Additionally, their pet, a dog that was recovering from a recent surgery, was also in the apartment, though surrounded by excrement after several days of apparent abandonment, something those who knew the couple insisted they would never have done willingly. However, at first, everything seemed to point to a voluntary disappearance. The police meticulously reviewed all the security cameras of the building and the surrounding areas, but they could not find a single image of the couple leaving the site. Then, they expanded the search to bus terminals, train stations, and nearby streets, but no trace of the couple was found anywhere in Busan. When they tracked their phones, they realized that both had been turned off on June 2, one day after Ming Yun's father called the police. Between the night of May 27 and June 2, when both phones were finally turned off, several friends and acquaintances kept in contact with them through messages and calls that, as the days went by, became increasingly strange. For example, on May 29, a coworker called Sun's phone. The person who answered was Ming Yoon, and without giving further explanations, he said that she could not go to work for the moment, and the call ended there. The next day, the theater company received a message sent from Sun's phone. It informed them that she was not in a condition to perform, and that she had been hospitalized again after causing another incident, just like the last time. The director of the company, who considered her a responsible and committed woman, later recalled that the tone of the message was quite rigid and excessively formal, different from the warm and close way she usually communicated. A day later, Ming Yoon explained to an employee of the theater that Sun was not answering calls because she was medicated and hospitalized. However, when inquiries were made at local hospitals, none had a record of her admission. "I have a pending matter. I won't be able to go to your house for 1 or 2 months." On June 2, he sent his father one last brief message that said, "I'm okay." After that, all contact ceased completely. When the police analyzed the phone signals, they discovered an unsettling fact. The phones had been turned off in completely different locations. Ming Yoon's phone was tracked for the last time near a bus stop in the Jijiang County of Busan, about 16 kilometers from the apartment, at around 9 a.m. 13 hours later, Sun's phone connected for the last time to an antenna in the Gangdong district, east of Seoul, nearly 400 kilometers away. On June 5th, having had no news of his daughter for days, Sun's mother tried to request a phone trace and discovered that Ming-yun's father had already filed a missing person report 5 days earlier, without notifying them or trying to contact them. When the woman's parents confronted this man and Ming-yun's stepmother, they received a quite cold response. They were told that the couple would return and that they should just wait and see. In subsequent interviews, the attitude of the father and the stepmother drew significant attention, as they appeared distant and unconcerned. Even his stepmother declared, "I imagine they are living well somewhere." Later, the father downplayed the disappearance and suggested that Sun might have left of her own free will. This stance baffled both relatives and acquaintances, especially since he himself had been the one to file the report. This attitude contrasted with that of Ming-yun's biological mother, who appeared desperate in public appearances. Music. Over time, some media began to speculate that the father and stepmother knew more than they were saying. For the authorities, the main suspect in the couple's disappearance was a woman who had been Ming-yun's first love, whom he had dated during adolescence. Although the couple had once planned to marry, the relationship ended due to the opposition of both families. She eventually married another man in 2004, but resumed contact with Ming-yun and got divorced. It was also said that her divorce occurred because her husband discovered she was still in contact with her ex. She remarried and moved to Norway in 2014. Later, she became pregnant by her second husband, but apparently, they continued to communicate. In fact, some people close to the situation claimed that Ming-yun carried a secondary phone that he used exclusively to talk to her for hours. After the death of her daughter in Norway in March 2015, this woman's behavior became more erratic. She began sending long, incoherent messages to Ming-yun with phrases like, "I will revive my daughter using cryogenics," or things like, "You ruined my life." She also started sending threatening messages to the couple before the wedding, telling them they would never be happy and that she would not allow the marriage to happen. The couple even hired private security for the ceremony and the celebration. Sun, affected by the situation, sought psychiatric care, legally changed her name and phone number, but told her friends she continued to receive deeply disturbing messages. When investigators reviewed the movements of the ex-girlfriend around the time of the disappearance, they realized she had returned to Korea shortly before the 28th of May 2016. During her stay, she used only cash and left no bank records. She lied to her mother, saying she was going to Africa, and it is known she left the country shortly after the disappearance. After this, the police requested help from Norwegian authorities and then from Interpol to extradite her so she could be arrested and interrogated. But in 2018, a Norwegian court denied the extradition, arguing that there was insufficient evidence of her involvement in the couple's disappearance. Over the years, multiple theories emerged. Some suggested the couple had hidden voluntarily, trying to escape from this woman upon learning she was in the city. But this would not explain the abandonment of their pet, the unpacked groceries, nor the absence of departure records. Others suggested that Ming-yun might have been the one to do something to Sun, which would explain the messages sent from her phone. But no signs of violence were found in the apartment. In the case that Ming-yun's ex-girlfriend had harmed them both, she would have had to get them out of the building, knowing perfectly well the blind spots of all the cameras there. Furthermore, she could not make any noise. There could be no struggle, and she had to be lucky enough not to draw anyone's attention. There are people who think the couple could have left the building through the emergency stairs since there were no security cameras there. However, there was a camera right at the entrance of that very stairwell. To this day, none of these theories has been 100% confirmed. And to make this case even more devastating, years later, Sun's parents learned that their daughter was 8 weeks pregnant at the time of her disappearance, which made this loss even more painful. Ming-yun's biological mother traveled to Norway with a documentary team to confront the ex-girlfriend, but she received no answers and ended up being sued for harassment. The truth is known only by Sun and Ming-yun, if they are still alive somewhere. The case of Lee Huno. We continue with a case that shocked the whole country, because the victim was a young boy of only 9 years old. Lee Huno lived with his family in the Gangnam district, a residential area of Seoul. He led a common life for a boy his age. He attended primary school, spent time with his friends, and usually played in the recreational areas of the apartment complex where he lived. He was known as a quiet and sociable boy. There were no records of family conflicts or personal problems. His environment was stable, and by 1991, South Korea was quickly heading toward modernization, although it still lacked many surveillance systems and technological tools that are considered basic today. It was in this context that on the afternoon of the 29th of January 1991, around 5:20 p.m., Lee went out to play in the playground of the Hyundai residential complex. As he often did, he was last seen near the swings, accompanied by other children. His family began to worry when the afternoon passed and Lee did not return home. At nightfall, they reported his disappearance to the police. Later, around 12:00 a.m., the family's phone began to ring. It was the voice of an unknown man who claimed to have the boy and demanded a ransom of approximately 70 million won, as well as a car equipped with a phone. From that moment on, a series of calls began that would last for more than a month. The kidnapper made more than 60 calls and gave changing instructions. He fixed meeting points in different parts of Seoul and constantly modified his demands. On several occasions, he ordered the parents to move to a specific area only to cancel the plan minutes later. The man seemed to be aware of police movements and adjusted his behavior to avoid being tracked. Given the gravity of the case, the police deployed one of the largest search operations of that era. Agents were mobilized across different districts. Public phones were checked, and all received calls were recorded. The voices were analyzed and compared with numerous suspects. However, in the early 90s, technological investigation tools were limited. As I mentioned before, there were no advanced geolocation systems or integrated digital databases. In addition, most of the calls came from public phones, which made it extremely difficult to identify their exact location. Music. Hundreds of people were interrogated, but none matched the kidnapper's voice. 44 days after the disappearance, on the 13th of March 1991, the worst happened. A group of workers found a body inside a drain located under the Olympic Expressway in the Jamsil area, south of Seoul. Authorities confirmed it was Lee Huno. The autopsy revealed the cause of death was asphyxia. He showed signs of having been tied up, and there was adhesive tape covering his eyes, nose, and mouth. There were also reports of head trauma. Forensic experts concluded, due to the state of his remains, that his life had been ended shortly after his kidnapping. It was likely that it happened on the same day he disappeared. That meant all those subsequent calls had been a strategy to extort the family, even knowing the boy was no longer alive. The news shocked the country. The press had followed the case day after day, and such a cruel outcome was simply devastating. Thus, the case of Lee Huno went from being a desperate search to a murder investigation. Despite having dozens of voice recordings, the police could never identify the person responsible. For years, the calls were reanalyzed and compared with new suspects, and at different times persons of interest appeared, including an individual known publicly as Suspect A, but none could be legally linked to the crime due to a lack of evidence. No definitive physical evidence was found, nor were there direct witnesses, nor records that allowed a precise reconstruction of what happened. The file remained open for more than a decade. However, on the 28th of January 2006, the case reached the statute of limitations under the legislation in force at the time, which legally prevented filing charges. The case of Lee Huno had a profound impact on Korean society, and throughout the years, investigative programs, documentaries, and special reports have re-examined the file. New voice analysis technologies have been applied, but until now, no breakthrough has allowed the culprit to be found. There is no conviction or judicial closure. Lee's family continues to wait for a piece of evidence, a testimony, or a confession to emerge that reveals what really happened. For now, the case remains unresolved. Music. The death of Kim Song-jae. Now we will tell you the story of an iconic figure in South Korean pop culture, Kim Song-jae. In the mid-90s, Song-jae became known as a member of the duo Do, where he stood out for his style that combined sharp choreography with elements of hip-hop and New Jack Swing. After the group split, he started a solo career that quickly placed him as one of the most important promises at that time. In life, he was admired for his stage charisma and professional discipline. His colleagues described him as a very cheerful person in public, but reserved in his personal life. His inner circle included his work team, former members of Do, and his romantic partner, whose identity was legally protected and usually appears in the media only as A. By 1995, Kim was going through a decisive moment. After years of success with the band, he was preparing to establish himself as a soloist. In November of that year, he returned from abroad with his team and began an intense promotional agenda. On November 19, He made his solo debut on an SBS music program, a performance that was well received by the public and seemed to mark the beginning of a new stage. But no one would imagine that this was to be his last appearance. That same night, after the performance, Kim had dinner with his girlfriend, his manager, and part of his team. Later, they visited a pool hall, and deep into the early morning, they returned to the place where they were staying, an annex of the Swiss Grand Hotel in the Seodaemungu area of Seoul. During the early morning, his girlfriend left the place, and hours later, when his manager tried to wake him to continue with the scheduled activities, he noticed that Kim did not respond and immediately requested medical help. Thus, on the 20th of November 1995, Kim Song-jae was officially declared dead. The news spread quickly and shocked the whole country, as just a day earlier he had debuted as a soloist in front of millions of viewers with great success. According to the autopsy, Kim had 28 injection marks on his right arm. Furthermore, components of the veterinary anesthetic Zolotil, a substance composed of taletamine and zolazepam, were detected in his system, rare in cases of human consumption. Also reported was that several of the marks were in areas difficult for a right-handed person to self-inject. These findings ruled out a natural death and opened the possibility of a homicide. The police investigation quickly focused on Kim's girlfriend, who was accused of having administered the substances. In the first trial, the court found her guilty and sentenced her to life imprisonment. Prosecutors argued that she had injected Kim while he slept. However, during the appeal process, the defense questioned the robustness of the evidence, pointed out inconsistencies in the forensic analyses, doubts about the exact chronology of death, and the lack of direct evidence to demonstrate homicidal intent. The Court of Appeals then revoked the sentence and acquitted the accused. Subsequently, the Supreme Court confirmed that decision, leaving the case without a definitive conviction, and legally, the case was closed as an accidental death. But despite the judicial ruling, public opinion was never satisfied. Many considered that the forensic findings were too strange to be a simple accident, and so, for years, both media and television investigation programs re-examined this case. In 2019, an attempt to air a special episode about Kim's death was blocked by a court order, as it was considered that it could damage the reputation of the ex-girlfriend without new evidence. Today, the death of Kim Song-jae remains one of the most controversial mysteries of Korean pop culture. His family and many followers continue to ask for transparency and clarity. On social media, his name continues to appear every so often, accompanied by questions and various theories. Kim Song-jae was an artist who was about to consolidate a new stage in his career, and the fact that he died young and under such strange circumstances undoubtedly turned him into a legend. Hello. We are taking a small break to remind you that if you are enjoying this content, we also have much more on other channels like Noctambulos Podcast, where we talk about paranormal topics and true crime cases. We also have Mundo Creepy Stories, where we tell the most chilling tales experienced by our audience. And in Creepypastas del Mundo Creepy, we narrate terrifying stories written by us. Everything is available on YouTube or your preferred podcast platform. Thank you very much. And we continue with the content. The Frog Boys of Daegu. This is probably one of the most well-known cases in South Korea, one that even to this day continues to leave many quite unsettling questions. In March 1991, 5 boys disappeared in Daegu, one of South Korea's main cities. They were Woo, 13, Jo, 12, Kim, 12, Park, just 9, and Kim, 11, all of whom came from working-class families in nearby neighborhoods and were known for their curiosity and love for nature. They spent their afternoons playing together after school and frequently made small excursions to nearby mountainous areas to look for salamander eggs and small amphibians. For this reason, over time, they would be known as the Frog Boys. For their parents, those outings were a normal part of childhood. The community was close-knit, and no one imagined they could be in danger. On the 26th of March 1991, while the first local elections in more than 3 decades were being held and schools remained closed, the boys asked for permission to go out, as they habitually did. Their families expected them to return before noon for lunch. That morning, the 5 friends headed toward Mount Waryong, a wooded area north of the city where they used to explore. However, as the hours passed without them returning, their relatives began to get uneasy. At nightfall, having no news of them, they notified the authorities. That same day, neighbors, police, and volunteers initiated a makeshift search along the trails, ravines, and wooded areas. They combed the most traveled paths and called out their names for hours, but found no trace. Helicopters, search dogs, and specialized teams were used. The national media began to broadcast the images and data of the boys, while television programs asked the public for help. In the days and months that followed, all kinds of theories arose. Some believed they had gotten lost and died of exposure to the cold, or that they could have been kidnapped. However, none of these hypotheses could be confirmed. For more than 11 years, there were no significant advances in the case. But on the 26th of September 2002, a hiker found skeletal remains and personal items, such as clothing, backpacks, and school supplies in a mountainous area of Mount Waryong. The site was relatively close to where the boys had last been seen. They were even in an area that had been registered in previous searches. The following day, the police confirmed that the remains belonged to the 5 missing minors. It had been 11.5 years since that day they left home. Forensic studies indicated that the boys had died shortly after getting lost in 1991. The initial hypothesis pointed to a possible death by hypothermia or prolonged exposure to the cold. However, the analysis of some skulls revealed lesions that could correspond to blows with blunt objects. For years, rumors had circulated about alleged military exercises in the area, but the authorities never officially confirmed direct evidence of this or outside involvement. The injuries were considered suspicious, but insufficient to establish a clear criminal cause. After the discovery, the investigation focused on reconstructing what happened. Files were reviewed, and witnesses were interrogated. Evidence was also reanalyzed without conclusive results. The families harshly criticized the initial handling of the case, arguing that the early search was not enough and was very disorganized. In 2005, the families filed a civil lawsuit against the state for alleged negligence. However, a year later, in 2006, the court dismissed the accusation, concluding that the authorities had acted according to the protocols available at the time. Over time, new theories emerged, such as the involvement of a lone killer or the possibility of a government cover-up, but none could be sustained. In recent years, the remains were analyzed with much more advanced forensic technology, but the results have been the same. The case remains unresolved. As there are no suspects and no clear cause of death, the families continue to remember their children and demand answers, while their story remains present thanks to documentaries and investigative programs. More than 3 decades later, the question remains open. What really happened to those 5 friends who went out to play on the mountain? Music, the Daegu subway fire. 5 months after the discovery of the Frog Boys' remains, on the 18th of February 2003, shortly before 10:00 a.m., also in the city of Daegu, one of the greatest tragedies in the city's history occurred. That morning, thousands of people were traveling on the subway on their way to work, school, or to carry out daily activities. Around 9:53 a.m., train number 1079 arrived at the Junggangno station. Among the passengers traveled a man who had boarded carrying 2 milk cartons. No one paid much attention to him, as he did not seem different from the rest of the users. But he was. And the fact is that this subject was not carrying milk in those cartons, but an inflammable liquid. Shortly after the train stopped at the station, the man, in front of the other passengers, ignited the contents of the cartons using a lighter, and the fire spread almost immediately inside the car, fueled by the highly flammable materials of the interior. And so, in a matter of minutes, a thick cloud of smoke began to cover everything. The smell was suffocating, and visibility was reduced rapidly. Some passengers managed to open the doors and escape to the platforms, but others remained trapped by panic and disorientation. Almost at the same time, another train, number 1080, entered the station without having received a clear warning about what was happening. Upon stopping next to the first one, it was also exposed to the fire, and thus the fire and smoke spread between both trains, turning the station and the tunnels into a death trap. By 9:57 a.m., the toxic smoke had already spread through corridors and cars. It was dense, dark, and suffocating. Many passengers were trapped without being able to distinguish the exits, and in the middle of the darkness and chaos, orientation became almost impossible. Some tried to move forward blindly through the tunnels. Others retreated in search of some escape route. The smoke burned their eyes, scraped their throats, and clouded their minds. In a few minutes, breathing became extremely complicated, The first emergency teams began to arrive shortly after 10:00 a.m., and they found a devastating scene. The trains were engulfed in flames. There were passengers trapped and smoke coming out of every opening. The firefighters then began the rescue and extinction work, but the tunnel's own ventilation system ended up favoring the spread of the fire by pushing the hot air and toxic gases. For several hours, rescuers advanced slowly among charred remains, both of the trains and of people. They made their way carefully among the deformed structures and with almost null visibility. Each meter traveled implied an enormous risk. The fire could not be controlled completely until around 1:30 p.m., and by then, the damage was irreversible. 192 people had lost their lives. Another 151 were injured, many with permanent consequences. Entire families remained marked by what happened that morning. Over the days, investigators determined that most of the victims did not die directly from the flames, but from the inhalation of smoke and toxic gases. As the polyurethane seats, linings, and other synthetic materials burned, large amounts of carbon monoxide and other lethal substances were released. Subsequent investigations quickly confirmed that the fire was a deliberate act, and thanks to testimonies and security cameras that captured the man manipulating the cartons with the flammable liquid before starting the fire, they managed to identify him. It was Kim Dae-han, 56. Although Kim had managed to escape the fire along with other passengers, just after starting it, he did not try to escape and was arrested immediately. Shortly after being detained, he confessed to his responsibility and stated that he was going through a deep depression and that his intention was to die in a crowded place, a version that did not finish convincing many, since his reaction immediately after starting the fire had been to escape the fire to save himself. In August 2003, Kim was sentenced to life imprisonment for multiple counts of murder and arson. During the judicial process, it was established that he acted alone and that this attack had been premeditated. He died in prison in 2004, according to official records. Investigations also revealed that there were serious structural and safety failures on the trains that led to the tragedy. For example, the ventilation system favored the spread of the fire, and the materials of the cars were highly flammable, which, as mentioned before, aggravated the disaster. The operating company acknowledged these deficiencies, removed the dangerous materials, and updated the emergency and communication protocols. The government declared a national disaster zone, created support funds for the victims, and pushed for reforms across the entire transport system. Since then, every February 18, the terrible tragedy that took the lives of nearly 200 people is remembered in Daegu. Music. The case of Park Chorong, Bitnari. The following is one of those cases that makes you lose a little more faith in humanity, especially because of who the victim was. Park Chorong was a girl of only 8 years old who lived with her family in Seoul. She was known by her parents and friends as someone cheerful and curious. She attended the local primary school and loved playing outdoors with her siblings. In late August 1997, after leaving an afternoon class, Chorong did not return home as she usually did. Her disappearance was reported almost immediately to the police when she did not appear at dinner time. Her mother called the English teacher, which was the class she had taken, also some of her classmates, and they mentioned they had seen Chorong leave with a woman. A few hours later, the Park family began receiving calls from an unknown number. A person on the other end of the line said they had their daughter and demanded a monetary ransom in exchange for setting her free. The police intervened quickly in the extortion case. They tracked the phone signal to a public phone on the street. When the police arrived at the scene, the caller had already left. They interrogated some witnesses who were at the scene, and they said they had seen a woman at that location. They described her as short and about 20 years old. The police took some fingerprint samples from the phone booth to continue the investigation. The next day, the calls continued. This time, they were able to track the call to a cafe in Mongdong. The police immediately went to the site and interrogated all the people inside the cafe, especially the women around 20 years old. One of them, who was pregnant, began to say she felt sick and that she needed to go to a hospital, which interrupted the identification process of the fingerprints. Having no real reason to hold her, the police had to let her go. Even so, they began to investigate all the women who had been present that day at the cafe and ordered police units to be sent to watch their houses. After that day, the calls ceased. A short time later, the police received a call from a man who said that his daughter, John Yunyu, who was in her third trimester of pregnancy, had escaped from home due to the presence of the police. The man and his wife were called to the station, where they were shown a recording of one of the calls, and they fully recognized their daughter's voice on them. Immediately, an operation was deployed to search every hotel, motel, or inn where she could be hiding. Less than a day later, they found her in a motel room. When they asked her about the girl, she denied everything. Shortly after, they searched the basement of her house, and there, inside an old display case, they found the naked body of Chorong inside a camping bag. She was dead. Analyses showed that the girl had died about 3 or 4 hours after being kidnapped. Apparently, she had been sedated and tied up. But after continuing to cry and complain, she ended up being killed. Something that draws a lot of attention about this case is Jeon Yeonyu, the pregnant woman. Why would someone like her want to kidnap a girl? For her acquaintances and friends, the answer was not very difficult to answer. She was known as a person who used to spend a lot of money and was deeply in debt. Furthermore, they also knew her as a pathological liar, willing to do anything to get her way. Once she made her statement, she said that the reason she had kidnapped Chorong was that upon seeing her walking with such beautiful and elegant clothes, she had assumed she belonged to a rich family and believed that she would get easy money that way. Jeon Yeonyu was sentenced to life imprisonment. She gave birth to her child on the 15th of October 1997, while she was in custody. Her baby initially remained with her in prison during the first few months. Afterward, the girl was handed over to her father, who gave her up for adoption. To date, Jeon continues to serve her sentence in prison in South Korea. Despite her tragic end, Chorong's family always remembers her with her smile, a kind attitude, and her eyes full of illusions. In Korea, a person's name is not just their identity, but it is usually associated with personality and even luck. Therefore, her parents had chosen that beautiful name for their daughter, Chorong Bitnari, which can be translated as the one who shines brightly. The crucifixion case of Moongyong. To finish this journey through the most disturbing parts of South Korea, we are going to the month of May 2011, in an abandoned quarry near Moongyong, when a gruesome and deeply unsettling scene was found. The body of a man was hanging from an improvised cross. He was semi-naked, wearing a crown of thorns, his hands and feet fixed to the cross with nails, and he also had a wound in his abdomen. He also had ropes around his neck. The discovery was made by a sheriff who was patrolling the area at sunset, and when he saw it, he could not believe what his eyes were observing. Immediately, he reported what he had found, and within minutes the area was cordoned off. Faced with such an extraordinary case, the police immediately requested an examination from the National Forensic Service. Forensics analyzed every detail, and according to the official report, the cause of death was a combination of internal hemorrhage and asphyxia by suspension. They did not detect clear traces that anyone else had intervened in the main injuries of the body. At the scene, tools such as an electric drill, nails, and a hammer were found. There were also notes at the scene with precise instructions to carry out the crucifixion, all indicating that the individual, for some reason, had decided to crucify himself. To test the physical viability of this assumption, investigators recreated the position of the body with mannequins and discovered that it was theoretically possible for someone to hang himself like that without outside help. The official verdict was that it was a ritualized act, that is, the victim had decided to end his own life that way for ritualistic reasons. However, the report also admitted that they could not rule out 100% the participation of third parties, as some conclusive evidence was missing in that regard. Soon the victim was identified as Kim Young-bong, 58, identified by the police as an ex-taxi driver, a resident of Changwon, a province of South Gyeongsang. It was learned that at the end of March he had sold his taxi, which was his source of income, and left the room he was renting. After this, in April, he bought an SUV and wood from a sawmill in Gimcheon. In other words, there is evidence of material planning consistent with a premeditated act. His friends and acquaintances described him as a good man, but extremely religious to the point of fanaticism. Furthermore, since 2008, Kim was a member of a blog run by Yong-woo, a former Christian minister who gave religious counseling, and he had met him on occasion. It is believed that after this encounter, his fanaticism increased to the degree that some people declared having heard him say, "I should become Jesus Christ." Even so, the authorities did not publish a single official motive beyond concluding that it was a planned act. The news of this act quickly monopolized the media and shocked public opinion. Some people, due to how graphic this event was, doubted the official explanation and wondered if this could have been a murder, as it seemed very difficult to believe that a person could do that to themselves. However, officially, the case was closed and no more attention was given to the matter, but questions and speculations still persist. And although for the authorities there is not much more to say about this situation, for many people, it is a South Korean mystery that has not been completely resolved. Thanks for reaching this part of the video. We hope that these mysteries from the other side of the world have terrified you or that you have found them interesting. Remember that a comment, a like, or sharing this video helps us reach many more people. And also remember that you can listen to all this not just on YouTube, but also on any podcast platform of your preference. Without anything more to add for this occasion, your friend says goodbye. See you next time. Yeah.